Thank you. Over to you, Leslie.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and a particular thanks to Paula and Anne-Marie at ARC for inviting me to do this study, and Paula in particular for writing it with me. She is responsible for the primary statistical analysis, so I'm not passing any blame. I take any blame for statistical questions. But this is an area that's a real passion of mine. I've been working with ethnic minority communities since 2002. And over that years, both in the UK and in Ireland, moving from England to Northern Ireland 5 years ago, I've been watching the changes in attitudes to ethnic minority groups, asylum seekers and refugees. And I think you'd agree we've seen some stark shifts in that time. And so looking at the 2017 data from the Northern Ireland Life and Time Survey, which surveys adults in Northern Ireland, and the Young Life and Time Survey, which surveys 16-year-olds in Northern Ireland, we see some pretty interesting patterns in this time. The first thing, I suppose, is to say, why do refugees warrant specific investigation? Well, there's a number of reasons for this. The first is we have obligations under international agreements to take refugees and to settle them in our societies, to provide a place of refuge from persecution and from war. And as we've seen conflicts raging at the edges of Europe and beyond over the last number of years, we've become increasingly aware that the politics of refugee acceptance and settlement is anything but progressive these days. So on the one hand, we have that global politics of refugee resettlement, and at the same time, we've seen increasing far-right attitudes across Europe, primarily and ostensibly in response to refugees and asylum seekers, but I think we could agree that there's much more going on beyond that as well. The refugee crisis, as it's called, is very much a proxy for other kinds of conversations about the types of society we want to live in. So, despite my interest in connecting the experiences of ethnic minorities, asylum seekers and refugees, I'm going to talk mainly today just about the acceptance of refugees in Northern Ireland. The other reason why we might be concerned with the acceptance of refugees in Northern Ireland is of course we know that in this particular territory there has always been a concern, or at least since 1998, around the time that the Northern Ireland Life and Time Survey was set up, with the integration of Northern Ireland, not least because it was assumed in that early heady period that the arrival of people from outside Northern Ireland might start to permit and facilitate different ways of mixing and being in Northern Ireland. Although, as we've seen in the MAC report that came out just a few weeks ago on segregation in the UK, Northern Ireland residents were much happier with the idea of segregated societies than anywhere else in the UK. So perhaps we still have a little way to go. Across Europe, then, we've seen some interesting trends in attitudes to refugees. We've seen, for example, the Italian Prime Minister being elected on a wave of xenophobic sentiment, and in fact, even in places like Galway, events being organised in support of those kinds of ideas. So we can see that the politics of anti-refugeeism, if you like, is global, and it moves fast. It relies on a fast-moving media, which is, it seems in some ways, quite freewheeling in its attitudes to diversity and tolerance. Across Europe, then, we've seen pretty dramatic shifts in attitudes. If I give you the example of Poland, in May 2015, a survey of Polish attitudes showed that 72% of Polish people were accepting of refugees and Poland's duty towards them. 72% put Poland amongst the most welcoming countries in Europe towards refugees, a real statement of tolerance and welcome. By 11 months later, April 2016, the number had dropped from 72% to just 33%. And I think you'll agree that's a terrifying drop. There are reasons, of course, why Poland would have such a shift. We've seen ourselves through the global media, the political changes, the landscape has been very volatile there. But also the very recent history of political change in Poland means that nationalist narratives are very, very much foremost in the political rhetoric and in the minds of the voting public. Perhaps that would make us very wary about the kinds of figures we would find here in Northern Ireland. where our national identities are so often the starting point for discussions, and very often also the end point for our discussions. In the Republic of Ireland, though, we've seen other kinds of shifts. Just this week, a survey was published on the attitudes of Irish people to the birthright citizenship of people born on the island of Ireland. You might remember that the Good Friday Agreement and the various politics around it ensured that anybody born on the island of Ireland was entitled to Irish citizenship. A case in Belfast of a Chinese woman who had a child here in Belfast and acquired Irish citizenship for it established that principle very firmly. The Irish government responded with a referendum in 2004 which removed the automatic birthright citizenship by birthright to any child born in Ireland unless they had an Irish parent or grandparent. It effectively removed the right of citizenship for any child whose parent was a non-national, the term that became very popular in the Republic of Ireland, and has left many, many children in a limbo where they've been unable, if their parents are asylum seekers or indeed migrants from countries that have changed and have been unable to return, left those children without any citizenship at all. And that has affected a whole range of rights that they have been unable to claim. So 79% of Irish people voted in that referendum in 2004 to remove the automatic right to citizenship by birth on the island. A big swing this week then when we saw that 71% people now support the automatic entitlement of those children to citizenship. So from 79% removing that right to 71% supporting its return. That's an enormous shift, I'm sure you'll agree. So these kinds of shifts are happening around us. That admittedly went from 2004 to 2018, but nonetheless, 14 years in which scholars and activists like myself did not anticipate that strength of feeling. Prompted, however, by an increasing number of deportations of school children and the campaigns that came from children around their right to stay. So I think in looking at the data we're looking at today, it's extraordinarily important that we take seriously the data concerning 16-year-olds, because the generational shift and the effect of deportations, of detentions, of, for example, resettlement and dispersal of refugees, children's exposure to diversity, all will change the next generation of voters. And so I'll come to around at the end of the presentation to talking again about age. The Northern Ireland Life and Times survey first asked about asylum seekers in 2005. And while the data that I'm talking about today is not about refugees, it is of course important to connect the two, because in the minds of the public, very often there is confusion between the two. And as we know, of course, asylum seekers do turn into refugees in many cases, although it's not a given. In 2005, when that question was asked, there was some narrow support for the idea of allowing asylum seekers to stay in Northern Ireland. Around 52% of people said that asylum seekers should be allowed to stay in Northern Ireland if they'd suffered persecution elsewhere. Only 21% disagreed and said that no asylum seeker should be allowed to stay. There were questions also on whether asylum seekers should be put in detention. Why? Because at that time, detention of asylum seekers was expanding across the UK. In fact, you might have remembered around 2005 was the time when the government published a number of papers on the need for detention of asylum seekers. Just before, a number of years later, those scandals erupted about their treatment. So the public was very aware of the connection of the idea of illegality or illegal immigration and asylum seekers, helped, of course, by our friends, the tabloids. But nonetheless, it was state action that made that a very firm connection in voters' minds. When we look in 2017 then, 12 years on after that, at refugees, we're looking at a different question, and we're looking in a different time. But it is worth remembering that it's not just, very often, I know my sociology students very often say, well, it's the media. Well, of course it is. It's always the media, stupid. However, it is worth pointing out that it is very often state action that prompts many of these messages in the first place, and not simply the media creating a fuss about nothing. So when we look today at the actions of government around Europe towards refugees and asylum seekers, we've seen in recent years the walls go up around Fortress Europe. We've seen arguments between European governments about what is a fair allocation of refugee resettlements. We've seen arguments over the Dublin Convention, which says that asylum seekers should register in the first country they arrive in. And of course, we've seen the debates around the pressures created in places like Greece and Italy on that. Is it any surprise then that we see those kinds of politics of the right arising in Greece and Italy in that kind of frame? Here on the edge of Europe, in Northern Ireland, where we not only rarely get asylum seekers arriving as a first point for registration, but we also aren't part of the resettlement programmes, the dispersal programmes in the UK, but rather have a small number of refugees resettled here and a very small number of asylum seekers first registering here each year. We might say that there is no room for that kind of anti-refugee attitude that we see in Greece and Italy. It might be supposed that people in Northern Ireland would feel relatively safe from the kinds of burdens that asylum seekers or refugees might be supposed to make on a society, as they are presumed to do in countries in Southern Europe. What else might explain the refugee attitudes that we see in Northern Ireland then? Well, coming out of the history of conflict, we might look at issues like security. International research, particularly in Europe, shows that concerns about security, and particularly around terrorism, are some of the most influential factors changing how people perceive refugees and asylum seekers. We can see that in Germany recently, far-right movements have particularly drawn on the ideas of crime, sexual assault, and so on in their discussions about whether refugees and asylum seekers should be in a society, much less about their eventual integration, the kinds of conversations we're usually having. But integration is a good reason to look at anti-refugee attitudes, because if we can't accept the idea of having refugees in our country in the first place, much less the idea of asylum seekers, there certainly is very little room for complacency around their eventual integration. Okay, let's jump into the data then. The first question I want to deal with is this. I think it is our duty to provide protection to refugees who are escaping persecution in their home country. Agree or disagree? Well, around 6 in 10, 61% of respondents to the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, that is adults, agreed with the statement. 61% puts us around 10% lower than the European average of 72%. Not quite so bad as Poland, thank God. Nonetheless, should we be positive about this 62%? Or should we be pessimistic about it? Let's find out. Our 16-year-olds, who we might think of as the most optimistic, said the same. 60%, compared to 61% of adults, agreed or strongly agreed with the statement. So we have a very similar pattern amongst both adults and 16-year-olds to this statement. It's our duty to provide protection to refugees escaping persecution in their home country. I wish we could take that at face value. Research internationally, however, on refugee attitudes shows that when a question like this is asked, the person being asked, the respondent, very often assumes we're talking about quote-unquote real refugees, authentic refugees. And yet the discourse internationally has been to assume that refugees are not always genuine, that their claims to escape persecution or war are somehow unfounded, irrelevant perhaps even, and that the claims are not always justifiable. Why is that? The public has a relatively poor understanding of international agreements on refugee resettlement, on arrival, on integration, and on those obligations that must be fulfilled, as well as the need to integrate refugees. So, back to the question. It's our duty to provide protection to refugees escaping persecution in their home country implies an authentic refugee. So while we can be positive about the 60%, 61% in Northern Ireland Life and Times, we have to have a cautious positive optimism about that, given the likelihood that respondents will perceive that as being authentic refugees and not anyone else. This is why it's important that we separate attitudes out to refugees and to asylum seekers, because doing so allows us to separate out some of those claims about authenticity that cause respondents so many problems. Interestingly, our 16-year-olds were more likely to agree with the statement than the others, or more likely to express strong agreement. So those who expressed strong agreement were 29% of 16-year-olds compared to 16% of adults with strong agreement. So our young people are perhaps more optimistic, more welcoming than the adults. We might want to look for patterns then in who is more welcoming. And in this I found a lot of similarities to the report I did for ARC 2 years ago on attitudes to ethnic minority communities. There's a strong principle that those who mix with others who become used to diversity become better at accepting diversity and difference, and this report very much bears out that principle. Amongst the Northern Ireland Life and Time respondents then, the highest support came from people who were living in areas that were neither loyalist nor Republican, areas that were mixed, areas that were urban. So it's something that occurs again and again in the data, both in this question and in the other two questions, that those people who lived in diverse areas, who led lives filled with diversity, were most accepting of the idea of diversity in future. There are associations between this question and that relating to immigration. Those who were most positive about an increase in immigration in Northern Ireland in future were also positive about the duty to protect refugees. Of those who weren't particularly positive about immigration, in fact those who disagreed with immigration into Northern Ireland, we still had 33% of those agreeing that there was a duty to provide protection for refugees, but it's a much, much smaller percent than those who agree with greater immigration. So we see a correlation there between those who are positive about immigration generally and those who are particularly positive about refugee protection. Those people who say that they're favourable to ethnic minority communities, equally, are largely those who are also welcoming towards refugees and underpin the idea of a duty to protect them. So here we have, again, as we do in the other questions, a positive attitude to immigration, a positive attitude to diversity. Some people who are saying that they're favourable to people from ethnic minority communities are those most likely to also see a positive duty towards refugees. So refugees in this sense do not stand alone, although I have made the point that they do warrant a specific investigation. This allows us to see that those positive attitudes to immigration and diversity generally are very predictive of those attitudes towards refugees. You might have seen on Twitter, anybody on Twitter? You might have seen on Twitter a lovely account called Harry's Last Stand. Harry was a soldier in World War II, and over the last 5 years on Twitter, he has made the point that World War II and the battles that were fought were about equality and tolerance and diversity and welcome, and that they were about underpinning principles in Europe which he saw as being eroded. He was indicative of a generation that saw World War II as have been fighting for something, and for him it was fighting for the protection of those who were most vulnerable. Harry, unfortunately, in this week is in hospital and very ill, and the flood of support for him on Twitter is quite indicative of the conversations, very difficult conversations that he's been having as an 80-something-year-old man on Twitter, so determined to get this principle across that diversity and equality were principles worth fighting for and worth perhaps even dying for, and that our progress should not forget those. And I bring up Harry's Last Stand because the question of age comes up here in the Northern Ireland Life and Time Survey and the Young Life and Time Survey, not simply to say that the old are more positive than the young or the young are more positive than the old, but to bring up more interesting and nuanced generational effects. So we saw that feelings of obligation to provide protection for refugees were much stronger in 55 to 64-year-olds than they were amongst 18 to 24-year-olds. 73% of 55 to 64-year-olds felt that duty strongly, whereas only 32% of the youngest group, 18 to 24, felt that. That's not to say that the youngest are less positive, because when we look at our 16-year-olds, they are again more positive. So are we seeing a generational change from old to middle to young? Is there a generational effect? A chance for more research, perhaps. I don't have a definite answer. But what I can say is that there certainly seems to be a positive effect in education, and some perhaps cause for concern about those 18 to 24-year-olds who are at the point in their lives where they're experiencing the most change, the most insecurity, and the most risk to their identities. So lots of work to be done still in understanding those generational or cohort effects, but certainly an interesting debate to keep having about whether we are generationally and by cohort becoming more or less positive to refugees. Okay, some interesting then responses in terms of the Young Life and Time survey. We saw that their overall attitudes were very similar, but I want to just point particularly to the strongest differences. The strongest differences among 16-year-olds appeared both in national identity and in education. So those of only 40% of those who described themselves as British agreed with our duty to provide protection to refugees, compared to 70% of those who described themselves as Irish, and 62% of those who described themselves as Northern Irish. 70% of those who described themselves as Irish, 62% Northern Irish, and 40% British. It raises questions about what it is about British identities in Northern Ireland that might make them less likely to be receptive to refugees. And I'm not one for an easy answer on this, I'm afraid. There are so many nuances to the ways in which we claim our identity and perceive our identities in Northern Ireland and across the whole of the UK and Ireland that this is, again, a cause for interrogation rather than a simple answer. What might make somebody who has a British identity, age 16, feel less likely to be welcoming to a refugee, to feel that that duty of protection doesn't apply? If we apply the international research from across Europe, we might connect those ideas of insecurity, feeling of uncertainty around one's identity with a decreased attitude of protection towards refugees. But this survey, unfortunately, does not give us that complex answer. In fact, I think that it's very difficult for surveys ever to give a complex answer like that. What it can point to is, again, areas where we might want to ask more questions. And I think Paul and I would very much agree that this report prompts us to a lot more questions rather than giving us simple answers. Education is another area where we have more questions than answers. That 71% of those in grammar schools were more likely to agree with the duty to protect refugees than those in further education colleges, just 36% there, or those in secondary schools, 50%, or even those in integrated schools where we might find more diversity, 59%. What makes grammar school children more likely to be accepting of refugees? In this case, not quite children, not quite adults, 16-year-olds on the cusp of adulthood. What makes them in grammar schools much more likely to be accepting of the idea of protection of refugees than those in integrated schools? It makes us ask questions about grammar school education in Northern Ireland and the experience in our integrated schools. Okay, so I want to leave that question of protecting refugees and go on to the other two questions. Perhaps I can deal next with the question of Northern Ireland as a welcoming society, the question that we've used as the title for this report. Is Northern Ireland a welcoming society? There's an odd parallel between this question and the question which I answered 2 years ago on attitudes to whether Northern Ireland is a racist society. Is Northern Ireland a racist society? Well, those who were not racist said that it was, or those who claimed not to be racist said it was, but equally so did people who said they themselves were racist. So this is a question that is complex in its answer, because there is no straightforward relationship between those who are less welcoming of refugees and who say Northern Ireland is welcoming of refugees and those who are more welcoming of refugees. So let's just take the overall figure. around half of Northern Ireland Life and Times respondents agreed that Northern Ireland was welcoming of refugees. That's less than the 60-odd% of those who said that they thought there was a duty to protect refugees in Northern Ireland. What is it that would make us say that Northern Ireland is not welcoming of refugees? Well, of course, we've seen in the last year, this 2017 data, of course, doesn't take in the recent media account, but I wanted to highlight it to you. Since it was announced that we have just received our 1,000th refugee under the resettlement scheme, there has been a lot of media coverage of the kinds of racism that refugees have experienced in Northern Ireland. But that's not the first time we've heard about it in the media here. Northern Ireland has variously been known as the hate crime capital of Europe. You might remember that lovely title we got. And equally, we have seen reports in various newspapers in Northern Ireland about refugees driven out of their homes, who have been attacked in the street, whose children have been bullied and harassed. And it's tugged at the heartstrings for many of us. We have wondered, how is it that we have become an unwelcoming society to outsiders? We know that ethnic minorities in Northern Ireland have experienced a lot of racism. Should refugees be any more or any less vulnerable to that? It's highly unlikely. But could we say that Northern Ireland overall is a welcoming society? It depends on the way you look at it. If you say that Northern Ireland's welcome includes the right to stay, includes the right to education, to health, to support, as well as being integrated into a community, then perhaps, yes, you would say Northern Ireland is a welcoming society. If, however, you think more in a more specific way about the kinds of welcome that you or I might personally give, you might say, no, it's not that welcoming. We haven't made the effort to go out and meet refugees. Many of those people who respond to this survey have not met refugees, do not meet refugees on a daily basis. Why? Because refugees tend to be settled in urban areas, as do asylum seekers, as do ethnic minorities. Northern Ireland particularly is segregated around those patterns for refugees. So the diversity that we see in our answers, the ways in which urban and rural divides are represented, those who lived in different kinds of areas, mixed areas, not loyalist, not nationalist, and so on, that may be more typical of and representative of the divide between where refugees live and don't live than it is of anything else. So Northern Ireland's divisions itself appear to reproduce here in the data. Nonetheless, we would like people to think of Northern Ireland as a welcoming society to refugees. What will persuade us to think of Northern Ireland as a welcoming society? If we ourselves feel welcome, if we ourselves feel integrated in our society, we are more likely to assume the society is welcoming to others. If we do not feel welcome in our own society, if we see division and difference around us, if we see the hurt and the effects of violence against those who represent difference, we are more likely to say that our society is not welcoming. And that's borne out by international research. That's the only indication we can use to try to interpret the results that come out of the 2017 data here. Because there are strong correlations here between those who might recognise the division and difference and hurt. It's no surprise that national identities again come up as having a strong correlation with those who recognise Northern Ireland as not being particularly welcome. It's no surprise that those who have the strongest civil rights traditions perhaps recognise that Northern Ireland may not be welcoming. However, cause for optimism? I think so. In thinking about Northern Ireland welcoming refugees, a whole range of factors are considered. And I think particularly when we look at young people, again we see differences in school types and in national identities. Here I might tell you that the type of education that somebody is in is much more influential on their answer of whether Northern Ireland is a welcoming society than their national identities. So while in the last question we considered those who identified as British were much less likely to express a duty of protection for refugees, here those who identify as Irish or British or Northern Irish were almost equally likely to say that Northern Ireland was a welcoming society. However, those in integrated schools, just 37% of them agreed that Northern Ireland was welcoming, while those in secondary and FE colleges had a much lower percentage, as well as grammar schools at just 21%. So those in grammar schools were much less likely to agree that Northern Ireland was a welcoming society than those in integrated schools. Again, raising questions about the kinds of experiences in education that 16-year-olds are having in Northern Ireland today. The very last thing I want to deal with then is our final question, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that follows this. A welcome for Syrians. The Northern Ireland Life and Time Survey and the Young Life and Time Survey, of course, they asked the same questions in this particular year. They asked people to think about the current situation of people from Syria and their support for allowing people from Syria to come to Northern Ireland. We had a reasonably good level of support in this. We had 57% agreeing or strongly agreeing that Syrians should be allowed to come to Northern Ireland. That is lower than the 60 and 61% expressing a duty of protection for refugees. And there are questions why Syrians might have lower support than refugees in general. Where they have lowest support, however, is perhaps the most interesting area of this, and because I don't want to, many of the patterns in this question reflect the patterns in other questions, but one pattern really stands out, and that is that those identifying as Protestant or British were least likely to agree with Syrians being allowed to come to Northern Ireland. Income was also a driver. Respondents from not well-off backgrounds were less likely to agree than those from average or well-off backgrounds. What is it about national identity and income security that might drive particular attitudes to those from Syria? Well, one of the kinds of connections we tried to make was what kinds of stereotypes are associated with Syrian refugees that might not be associated with others? Or what kind of areas have Syrian refugees been settled in Northern Ireland that might make particular knowledge of those groups influence the answer? I think we come back again and again to the same question. How secure do people feel in Northern Ireland about their own community, about their own identity, and, in this case, about their own education or income? Because perceptions of security are much more influential than actual levels of security. Perceptions of security drive our fear of crime. They drive our fear of exclusion. They drive our fear of division. There is no reason at all why they shouldn't also drive our fear of refugees. And so if we were to extrapolate from that and ask another question, it's this. What is it about the insecurity of those who identify as British in Northern Ireland today that make them particularly hostile to the idea of Syrian refugees? And can we learn something in our conversations about how we develop integration in Northern Ireland that addresses that perception of insecurity? I started by saying that Northern Ireland, at the 60 and 61% support for refugees, is 10% lower than the European average. I think given the history of Northern Ireland's conflict, the continuing discussions around identity, the discussions that are all too prevalent in the British tabloids and Irish tabloids that we read here in Northern Ireland around Islamophobia, around the terrorism risks that are apparently caused by fake refugees, around the questions of the authenticity of refugees. It is surprising, I think, in the context of all that we still have a level of support at 60 and 61%. So I'm going to say today that I propose that we view this optimistically and hope that Northern Ireland increases its support in the next number of years, and I very much look forward to seeing the data from 2018 and 2019 in terms of our attitudes to ethnic minorities, asylum seekers and refugees, and I hope that you with me will look forward to that data looking more positive in future as well. Thank you very much for your attention and patience today. Very much appreciated, and we look forward to your questions.